So I have been called by some of the people who don't like my information, a windbag, and I can get going, sometimes exceeding Class 8 wind speeds on my presentations. But I don't want you to get nervous. I just want you to sit back and relax. All the slides are available. There's more slides than you would ever look at that are in this publication, or which coming from a publication that I'm about to come out with. So all my life, I've been mobile. I've been biking since I was 4, and I still do every other day. I bike about 40 miles an hour because it's the moment when I have cognitive and endorphin flow. And I do some of my best thinking, plus I experience it at 2,500 miles per gallon. So I encourage complete cities everywhere for people to safely be able to bicycle at their own pace. And you'll hear more about why this particular slide. I don't know if that's Steve Jobs on that bike, but it kind of sums up my life. I'm basically curious, and I need some endorphins from bicycling. So most of my life has been spent promoting what I call the equivalent of our body's ATP. We need a new societal green ATP, which is in the mitochondria and powers our body's cells, adenosine triphosphate. And so from all that I have gathered over the many decades is that the big shift is clearly, and I started this back in the 70s, coming to Washington in 79 with the idea of we've got to use this internet. It's an amazing gold mine. And so I've spent since then promoting data, information, knowledge, and wise decision making, which we are grossly lacking, is now the less or least cost and risk resource currency. The more information we can use wisely in designing, the less material and energy we need as input, throughput, and waste outputs. So in this age of information, ignorance is an unacceptable choice. And we're living in an age of ignorance right now, as I don't think I have much to convince you. We're in the midst of ruptures, and I identify 3 ruptures. Disruptions, which I think can be largely for the good, certainly for the next couple of decades if used appropriately, and it can be bad disruptions. Eruptions and corruptions. So let's get the corruptions right up out front and center. So we have 3 types of corruption I see, and that is in the political arena, in the business arena, and in the media. And particularly the collusions between those 3. I left off because we are here in a house of worship, but I think religions should be added. Not so much the Unitarians or the Pope, but certainly evangelicals who have led the battle to oppose any action on both climate solutions and a solar economy generally. I don't think I have to say more than this, but except that I was stunned at how cheaply you can buy an entire political party. I estimate, looking at the records, about $1 billion was spent over the previous 6 years to derail all the climate bills, the energy bills, to provide continued subsidies, and to elect our criminal-in-chief. And now, I don't know, I haven't seen the figures for the election, but we spent about $7 billion in the last election. I think about 3 to 4 for the presidency and 2 to 3 for the Congress. But they basically, that was fossil money that has become the source of campaign money, legalized graft for the Congress. And so they now have the White House, the Congress, and the courts because they basically got to select who was the missing seats. So the media has been particularly derelict, not only in the overt attacks like Fox News, but also in this false equivalency that when you have preeminent scientists and preeminent experts, and somehow you got to put a loony bin on the other side to kind of make a sense of equal equivalence, and it's just a false equivalence. It also sustains and maintains and retains the fossil fuel subsidies, which this is the summary of a 2015 report by the International Monetary Fund, which found that globally there's about $5.5 trillion of subsidies and avoided costs that go to the fossil fuel industry. That includes quantifying or monetizing carbon emissions at $100 a ton. The bottom line is that the persistence of these subsidies and of the decisions to push for more fossils in the face of market wanting something completely different, we now are desperately in need of solutions to some truly wicked problems. They're very complex and dynamic. They feed back, and they're in nested hierarchies, and they require efforts at multi-scales. This is why most people give up and say, I've got to just leave it to the government or to the market to decide, when in fact, I think the approach that I'm going to present to you in the next few minutes argues that we can, through network collaboration, actually facilitate exchanges at all these levels interacting so that we can address them much more effectively, efficiently, and cost minimally. My basic push, particularly now, I think I'm among all of you in saying that we're all about the same age. Maybe a couple of you are a little younger, but you know, when we get at our age, it's like, damn the institutions and organizations, full steam ahead. And I think for this generation, the young generation coming up in the gig economy, they're not going to experience the institutions and organizations like we did growing up, where you stayed with an organization and you tended not to get outside the bounds of respectability in what you commented and what you try to do. So I think we're going to have a much more volatile younger generation. But I still think for all of us who are at the peak of their prime and you know, it's not aging, it's saging, that what we have here is an opportunity to get involved and bring to them some insights. I spent a year at Google, and I was profoundly sad at the ageism that was going on there. This was 2007, where I was sitting in the cafeteria, and I overheard two young guys in their 20s talking, and they said, oh man, I just got off the phone with this guy, 45. I mean, these people over 40 are just useless. I gave him this question. I said, what's the cost of electricity in Malaysia? And he said, God, I guess I'll have to go to the library and look it up or call them up. And he said, I just have no time for them. And I just shook my head. I didn't want to say anything, but we have a lot to offer, and I saw that reinventing the wheel over and over again at Google. If they had just tried to reach out and be a little bit more interested in what has happened, they would have seen something different. So my imperative is to accelerate massive multi-scaling of citizen change agents committed to actionable change, not just talking like I'm doing right now or writing like I do most days, but committed to actionable change of public policies and market practices. And so some of you may have seen a readiness matrix for change, and you know, on the one axis, leadership change capacity, is it 0 or is it right up there at the top? And organizational change capacity, again, is there nothing? And does it basically resist change, or is it in full steam ahead? I obviously want to be in the ready for change quadrant, and I think much of my life has been in the ready for learning, where I've absorbed and absorbed and absorbed and thought, if we just learn, we'll get there. And it's, of course, now with all the cognitive science research, we're finding out facts just don't get through to a large segment of the population because they have that filter going on before they even consider that information. And so it's emotional connection storytelling, obviously. So I think ready for action actually makes more sense because you're actually out engaging with people you disagree and trying to get things done, and change comes about. But that ready for resistance is clearly like the fossil fuel industry. They're digging in and they're entrenched. And the ready for frustration are a lot of those that want to do countless studies but take no action. However, the mayors are the new potential actionable change. This was the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate Energy. There's now over 10,000 cities that represent, I think, now over 1 billion people worldwide that have committed to zero emissions and moving to 100% solar. So this is clearly the crowd that I think we want to focus on. But generally, still, you know, the problem with the diffuse opinion is that it tends to agree with the things that need to be done. This is the U.S. States and nationwide, where you have quite compelling, strong support for moving to an entirely solar, wind, efficiency economy, and yet, you know, $1 billion buys you an entire political party. So let me just take a few seconds to talk about where I focus now, which is in disruptions. And disruptions, if you've been, I think it's kind of hard for anybody not to avoid the rapid change that's occurred in technology, but I've been following it since the 60s. In fact, I started in the 50s when I was reading Isaac Asimov, and I clearly saw where we were headed out into space, and I was riveted by that, along with exploring the sea with Jacques Cousteau and the stars with Carl Sagan. So from a very early age, I wanted to be a planetary physician. And I still haven't gotten there, but I'm working at it as hard as I can. But the technology is helping. And for those of you who may have read or heard Ray Kurzweil speak, he is the optimist, and he points out that we're experiencing these laws of accelerating returns, where you're seeing the synergisms and the convergences between information technologies, the communication technologies, the miniaturization of technologies, and what I and a small cluster of people call COIN technologies, collaborative innovation networks or collective intelligence networks. This is due, and we're headed towards the Internet of Everything because of Moore's Law, the doubling every 24 months on the performance of microchips and their cut in cost, as well as telecom, Metcalfe's Law. The more people that use the network, the more powerful it becomes. And then the large numbers law of what you can do with big data. So this is due in turn, or driving rather, the explosive exponential trends in smart wireless sensor networks, which are being put into everything that needs to be monitored or predictive maintenance. The military was one of the earliest, where planes, ships, and other equipment, they wanted to know when they had to do repair and maintenance. And the other, of course, is from about 2007, the smartphone just has been proliferating worldwide. It's now over 4 billion have smartphones worldwide, and certainly with smartphones down to, I think, $50 now, it's pretty much moving very rapidly. People have smartphones in developing countries before they have indoor toilets or a host of other things. So you take these trends, and in fact, Cisco has been arguing that we're moving from the cloud to fog. Fog is those right at the point of the smart wireless sensors, because the price of storage of information is dropping even faster than the communication channels to move information, so it's changing the amount of usefulness of on-site data. You can now basically think of turning buildings into nanogrids, not just neighborhoods of microgrids connecting buildings, but individual buildings that are completely wired so that you can run in a continuous commissioning mode. So if you've designed your building as a platinum LEED building, typically in 3 years or so, the performance of those declines about 30% in efficiency. So unless you are continuously monitoring, you lose that design space. And so this basically will allow for a data lake of information on your nanogrid, and in fact, plug in your electric vehicle, interoperable with other buildings and portable, and you have a picogrid that can move around. So we're now, I think, in a period where you could call it a fractal energy system, where we're moving from the picogrid to the fractal, the nanogrid. Nanos connect into a micro. Neighborhoods, micros connect into a city as a platform, mini grid platform, and then cities laterally linking together into a macro grid. And then if you need a super grid that goes intercontinental or continental-wide, that's kind of a last resort. And it's done not, well, I'll come to a key point of why this fractal model is important. So what you've seen over the last 20 years is super exponential rates of technological disruption, and that convergence has been the integration of electrification, digitization, then the digitalization of an entire organization or institution, the mass minimization. Bob, again, got me thinking about this back in 1978 when he published along with Mark Ross' book, Our Energy Regaining Control, and talked about the materialization of of the society, and it was just some of the most exciting work where we were starting our dematerialization. But that also allows for miniaturization, modularization, and then all combined into the internetization, where we now have Internet Protocol version 6, which has enough addressing for trillions and trillions of connections in the network, hence the Internet of Networks, or the Internet of everything. So you're seeing things like in the automobile industry, converging technologies where you have vehicle-to-vehicle communication, where you don't go bumping into people because they have sensors on their cars. You have vehicle-to-grid, where you have two-way flows of electricity or one-way flow. And in fact, California, there was just a study completed with LBL, Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, and Tesla that shows that they can basically have control of that exchange such that you can provide the same storage service that California is now mandated on-site storage, but at a fraction of the cost. It's a brilliant paper. If we get to the, if I get enough time, because I'm rambling, but we'll take a couple of looks at the slides. But this whole idea of taking what used to be siloed utility grid, auto industry, buildings, and now looking at convergences, you're looking at a lot of capital savings as well as operating savings and getting kind of tax-free, taxpayer-free, ratepayer-free reductions in emissions of all sorts. We also now have most people walking around with personal supercomputers in their pocket. Ray Kurzweil likes to say you got $1 trillion computer in your pocket. It just also happens to make phone calls. Tony Seba, who's another optimist, says it's probably more around $600 billion. But still, it's a chunk of change that you're carrying around in your pocket, and you basically can be a lifelong learner in basically innumerable ways, which I'll show. One of them being that you can grow at a self-pace your own human and knowledge capital, which we tend to denigrate and only focus on financial capital. But I think the human and knowledge capital is going to be really important to emphasize, particularly as our institutions let us down more and more. Education has just turned out to be continuation of last century's Industrial Revolution, where we wanted to train people for the assembly line and the secretarial pool, and so that meant take lessons, observe them correctly, and then hand it back to the teacher. You got stamped approved, you moved through the grade to the next level, and that showed that you knew how the system worked. Well, today, era, you need to be a lifelong learner and infinitely curious, learning new skills and tools on the fly, so that you're capable of taking advantage of when luck, what do they say, luck is when preparation meets opportunity. So, but also, most importantly, and we see this with young people galore, I saw it at Google quite frequently, is the way they network to learn more rapidly, and this peer-to-peer learning process. So you can use your human and knowledge capital for also growing a community social, civic, and intelligence capital. For the last 3 years, I've been working in Europe doing these 500-page strategic roadmaps for countries and regions, working with Jeremy Rifkin on a concept called the Third Industrial Revolution. And it carries, at its core, is this whole idea of Internet of Networks. In Finland, they've taken this seriously. So they don't have teachers anymore. The teachers are now coaches. They don't have students at desks. They get together and they form a team. So in working as a team, they're given a challenge or an exercise. They can use the internet. They discuss with each other. They can go inside or outside, and they come to results collectively as a team effort. So they begin to appreciate that everybody has a different perspective and skills and talents and pace. And so I think that is going to be the types of important skills that are moving us forward. So apps, the applications that people now use on their phones are growing exponentially, and I think from my perspective, I'll come back to the importance of apps, but I want to put into an overall several hundred-year context. This is There's a lot of people that write about the current being either a fourth industrial revolution, like the head of the World Economic Forum published his book. Jeremy calls it the third industrial revolution, and this is kind of how he views it, that the first industrial revolution, where each industrial revolution, he argued, you see three primary changes in energy, mobility, and communications. So in the first industrial revolution, coal was harnessed and producing steam, extracting coal, new energy system. It was put on rails and became a new mobility system. And it was used for generating electricity to provide for telegraph communications and the printed book. The second industrial revolution superseded, and when these converged, they created exponential growth in productivity. So the second one comes along, cheap Texas oil, cheap Saudi oil, new energy system, highways, cars, trucks, and buses, new mobility system, and then the telephone, radio, and TV, new communication systems. And now we are in the midst of the third industrial revolution, which is arguably a new energy system based on solar, overwhelmingly. Secondly, but renewables broadly. Second is mobility of electric vehicles. This particular one that I'm showing here is the Ollie trolley. You may have heard about it. It's the 3D printed trolley that IBM Watson did the design, and it's an autonomous trolley, electric vehicle. And that company is now looking to provide such 3D printed vans or trolleys to campuses. And then, of course, the new communication system is the internet. So this has given rise to the new concept of platforms. And if you haven't followed platforms, but you probably hear it every day, everybody calls everything a platform, just like those in my field call everything an effort to promote sustainability. It's a word that has become used so frequently that it really is meaningless. And yet there is a more technical approach to what platforms can do, going back to Metcalfe's law, that the more people you get on a network, the more value you can create. And so this is three professors out of MIT, Boston College, and Dartmouth who have written a couple of books on the Platform Manifesto, which is the idea of an open source internet collaboration network, which is populated by apps as an ecosystem. And this ecosystem is designed to draw citizens to interact and transact on that platform. Now, real-world examples of that, of course, are like Uber and Lyft or Airbnb, where that platform allows people to independently arrange through a kind of a trust factor by telling people how your experience was and vice versa with the house owner or the driver. So you have a trust platform that's developed, and Robin, blocking on her name right now, she wrote Peers Inc., but she started Zipcar. But she talks about this phenomena of the large platforms, but empowering individuals to be able to interact and transact so that we shift from just being consumers to becoming prosumers. We produce as well as consume, and it's a whole new way of operating. Wikipedia, I think, is one of the best examples of this. It started, I think, about 16, 18 years ago, and initially, it was designed so that only experts would write articles, and it failed miserably. So then they just open sourced it, and next thing you know, there were 100,000 people that started writing articles for Wikipedia, and within 6 years, it became, with just 6 employees, became bigger than the Encyclopedia Britannica. And now, 15 years later, its monthly readership is about 500 million worldwide. It's the 5th largest website in the world. There's 34 million articles. They're being translated into 288 languages. And they've been written by over 50 million registered users and anonymous editors and supporters. And so it's now exceeded 15,000 volumes of Encyclopedia Britannica. So it's the world's largest open source encyclopedia. IBM did an analysis, and they found out that it took about 100 million hours of this free time to create it, which sounds immense until you realize that that's about the amount of time that Americans watch TV ads every weekend on television. In fact, it's less hours than people check their Facebook every day in the US. So this has led Clay Shirky, professor of media at New York University, written 2 books, one called Cognitive Surplus. He calls the time we watch TV the opportunity for cognitive leisure to actually shift to be able to create these new types of platforms. And because they're not doing it for money, people are doing it to show their expertise or just because they love the knowledge and curiosity. And so if you look at the average leisure time on an average day for a person, there is quite a bit of human capital that we can tap, an intelligence capital. So this has been my work for the last decade plus, is catalyzing collaborative innovation networks. And that's defined, or coined as they call them, an ad hoc, self-organized groups of self-motivated citizens, geographically dispersed, focused on accomplishing a specific mission. So my specific mission has been Assets for Life, which is titled that way, or just Assets, which is apps for spurring solar and efficiency technology. And the idea is to gather people to interact and transact online so that they create the tools and the resources that enable any citizen to be a change agent in any community to move forward. And when they get hit with a barrier or a cynic or a skeptic or some type of technological or financial wall, they can query the system to find out how others have resolved these problems and in fact turn them into a very positive result. So MIT has a Center for Collective Intelligence and they hold annual meetings. Peter Glure is one of their top persons, and he kind of likens it to a beehive, where you have the creator who has a centralized leadership role, maybe with the innovation of the idea, but then the Collaborative Innovation Network has rotating leaders. In Wikipedia, they're actually called gardeners, who go about and garden when people post things that are inappropriate, particularly on subjective issues like around abortion, although article in Science and Nature showed that the quantitative and factual-based information was as good as any encyclopedia. So, but then you have a collaborative learning network, and that's what I see happening on the platforms. You have clusters forming, and these clusters may want to take a particular piece of information and just work that issue, passive houses, or getting through, doing an inventory of all the rooftops and ground spots that are solar capable, and then and analyzing the economics of that and the financing of that, and then having that available online. There's about half a dozen apps that do that very well already. Most of them are proprietary, although NREL and some others are open source. So this whole collaborative innovation process has quite a bit of expertise behind it, and I won't go into it other than to say that the book that I'm coming out with is not really a book. I call it a Bloom, and this, what you're seeing, is excerpts from my Bloom. Bloom is a book-like online open source multimedia platform. So all these little busy bees think of citizens who are participating. They're either using the information, they're adding to the information, they're querying, so it's conversations, it's calculations, it's scenarios. And then my partner added an element, April Alderdice, who I was hoping would be here tonight, but she didn't make the flight in from Seattle. But April used to work at NREL on solar village programs, and then she went to Bangladesh in the mid-90s to work with Muhammad Yunus in launching Grameen Shakti, the solar village program. And then for the last 15 years, she's run her own business, CEO in India and Kenya, has financed installation of 5 million systems. But she remains a geek, and when she comes back to Seattle, she goes to these hackathons, and she's totally immersed in headsets that are developing augmented reality and virtual reality. And she is developing a concept called the Climate VR Room, whereas I was developing this platform that is just smartphone accessible and based. And so we put our heads together, and we are launching a social enterprise where we want to have it test bedded in cities and campuses initially. So We've gotten some large data sets to start with, which I'll show you in a little bit. But we have right now commitments from the Chief Sustainability Officer of the city of Palo Alto and Boulder, as well as UC Boulder Chief Sustainability Officer, as well as former Governor Ritter at CSU Fort Collins, the president of Arizona State University, who has this decision center that does scenarios and brings in these skeptical politicians to show them, let's run a scenario out of what Arizona is going to experience with climate change. But now let's take a look at, we have all this solar, let's take a look about exporting solar to California and what does that look like. And he's been able to visualize for people what they will never read or let alone discuss, but when they see it, it suddenly opens their minds in a different way. And that's what we're hoping this will do. So the idea is, I think whether you're concerned about climate change or you're concerned about the new wave of cyber terrorism and the fact that we now live permanently with uncertainty and surprises, why, for example, and these are issues that actually were raised back in the 80s and were not taken seriously enough to pursue, but real homeland security, I believe, is to have your communities as efficient and as much local power as possible. And certainly in the intervening years since the 1980s, the prices have come down, so now it just makes obvious sense. It's just that you have a very entrenched incumbent industry that makes their money building more large-scale platforms. This is another thing that really was brought home by Bob Williams' work and why these large-scale plants made sense when you were in an economy of scales of building giant factories. But now with modularization and mass minimization, you know, you can 3D print cars. It's a total different landscape. So I have actually taken part of the platform to develop homeland securities in the sense of bonds, and that we had to use the sovereign backing of the federal government instead of spending $6 trillion like we did going over to Iraq and Afghanistan. That would have more than financed the entire country to basically have taken advantage of all those solar-capable rooftops and ground spots. In fact, Larry Kazmierski at NREL used to say in the 90s that about 10 to 15% of an urban area was sufficient to provide 100% of all energy sources, again, hypothetically, because you know you have storage issues and that sort of thing. But so you know, that from a conservationist perspective like mine was always something that if you could develop energy services that didn't require taking out rainforest or building a massive hydro dam that flooded vast areas of tropics and then unwittingly released methane, greenhouse gases, you could do it right in the urban area, create more jobs, value add to your homes, and then also make it an uninteresting target for cyber terrorists and cyber attackers, or the climate destabilization that's clearly unfolding. You know, if you look at what's happened in Florida, the streetlights that are solar powered, the homes that are solar powered and following high efficiency guidelines are the ones that survive through a lot of the most horrendous disasters. So the way of thinking of this is if you were to mesh together Wikipedia, a Facebook conversation. Facebook is horrible in that it has no memory. It's just one running at the mouth kind of tidbits that get you exercise for the moment, but you can't go back and find anything. So that's why the Wikipedia memory is valuable. But then augmented reality apps, all the smartphone companies are moving so that you can actually begin having AR and VR experiences with your smartphone. YouTube, which is a vast repository to figure out how to do anything you don't know how to do, and you can watch 2, 3, 4, 5 visuals. I've learned how to darn socks that way and fix my lawnmower and do a host of things, but there's no reason you can't figure out how to build a whole city of, that is resilient. And then Google Earth. So we can GPS, GIS, everything. So this is one of the apps. It's not mine. It happens to be CH2M Hill, which was one of the early entrants into this field. And they market doing all the solar rooftop capabilities and the economic analysis, financial analysis for cities and military bases. This is one conceptual idea of, you look at the bottom part, is a walkthrough of a building. You basically Google Earth down to, this is the building, the Alliance for Sustainable Colorado on Wynkoop in downtown Denver. Goes on to the rooftop, then in the building, and then takes you on a 3D tour around the building to see how did they achieve platinum certification, a LEED certification. That building has since gone on to become wired for DC power with on-site solar and has become a nanogrid. And it runs software to continuously monitor its performance to make sure it stayed in the design level. But you can use these apps, and the fact that your phone is a video camera and recording device, to do things like when Rocky Mountain Institute did they do these 10x improvement learning exercises, these iconic buildings. This happens to be the New York Empire Building, where they opened up a little mini factory inside and produced super window technology and installed all brand new super window technology in New York. So instead of, the initial estimate was they could basically improve New York State Building. This is a energy service provider, estimated they get 18% savings. And RMI came in and for the same amount of money got close to 45% savings. In fact, in Denver, if you know where the downtown is it the GSA building, I think, which was rehabbed after 50 years a few years ago, and RMI was able to come in, and they found 90% savings. And then the Historical Society said, well, you can't touch those 1950 windows, which are smoky black, because they're historically important, which I thought was rather hysterical. And so that still knocked down the savings to 80%. And then when we took the tour of the building, it was bizarre that the mechanical engineers had cited the piping all through the building in the very way that Amory has been pointing out for 20 years that you don't want to do. They had smaller pipes, they were sharp angled, lots of friction all through there, whereas they should have gone for bigger pipes, less, and not the elbow changes, but graduated changes. So they could have gotten more savings there. But that, I said, did you videotape that? Are you going to have that as an interactive design tool to teach others? And they go, no, we didn't think about that. And this is why the platform is so important. It is the only tool currently available, and I can't think of any other, that provides for scalability, multi-scalability, because you're able to scale at different levels, whether it's your house level, your neighborhood, all the way up to global analyses. And it gives rise for nurturing the kind of a Cambrian explosion of innovation in apps. So they keep getting better and better and being able to perform better, so that we just know that we're just at the juvenile stage of all this. The one that I would love to see done, and as far as I know, nobody has yet, is Art Rosenfeld, professor at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, considered the grandfather of energy efficiency, or the father of efficiency. Started working in the early 80s, pointing out, well, you know, we have these urban heat islands. If we just painted the surfaces of the rooftops white and let them reflect the heat away and put cementitious surfaces on dark black asphalt, we would cool down cities so that when cars stop, you know, when the car stops on a hot day, it's still giving off volatile organic compounds. But you also plant some canopies of trees, and you basically cool the cars down faster, so they're giving off emissions, and they can keep bad smog episodes from occurring even at a higher temperature. So the most recent estimate that Art was involved in, just prior to his passing away, sadly, was estimating what if we were to do the roofs and road tops for the cities of the world. And they estimated that it would save several $1 trillion and reduce 50 billion tons of CO2. 50 billion tons is what the world produces in a year. So you're saving money. That's the only geoengineering experiment I can think of at this point. And Art set up an organization to promote this, but again, in the infinite stupidity in Congress, do you think this type of program is embraced? No, it's cut. The research monies are cut. It's just unfathomable. Arizona State, as part of their research center, is also looking at city-level emissions so that you can begin to hone in on where your largest opportunities are. And this is only going to get more and more refined and allowing priority breaking. The people in the building movement have known this for years. Those early adopters of building information models, which now BIM also stands for Building Intelligence Management. I mean, it's just gone through an entire amazing transformation. So you move quickly from 3D tools to now people are saying we're moving beyond BIM 7, where you're basically getting close to a cradle-to-cradle operation from the initial design of the building by architects who will use the same database that then hands off to the construction engineers, who then hand off to the commissioning of the building, who then hand off to the facility managers to make sure it's in its design space, who then hand off the same data set to the people who are going to modify the buildings, like is going on in California right now. They have to upgrade all the California community colleges to I think net zero by a certain date, 2025. So the California Community College, which is 100 campuses, I think 5,000 or 10,000 buildings, and tens of thousands of rooms, has it all on the same data set. And then they have an application layer, which is populated with the ecosystem of apps. And so an architect who wants to go into the San Diego campus and look at room to room to see if it could use daylighting for shading or some other aspect or upgrade of the lighting system can do that now from same data. And it's got good encryption, so you can't you can't hack the system. And the military was so impressed with this that they contracted with the fellow who designed that for him, Kimono Numa, who's an architect who started working in 1980 with the Coast Guard to get them to digitize everything and save them millions and millions of dollars. And then in the 90s, got them to start using BIM tools. And he's now come to the point where he visualizes and walks through the designers, the builders, and the constructors, and shows them how this all can be done with the new tools that integrate all these. Used to be you would have to have a dozen different proprietary databases for each of those sectors. Now they all work off the same data, and they have their applications on the platform. So in this case, here you can look at this as one visualization, but you can already see some opportunities for improving even that, and this is the design stage. And as Amory pointed out, you could design to save 90% of pipe and duct friction, which amounts to about half the electric output of coal plants in the world. And that typical payback on new builds is 0 or 1 year payback, even with retrofits. And China is doing this gangbusters because 60% of all of their electricity is for motors, pumps, compressors, and fans. And the first province to do that with NRDC's support and Natural Resources Defense Council found just in their largest industries 10,000 megawatts of what they call an efficiency power plant, just by replacing out the inefficient electrical drive equipment at a levelized cost of electricity of 1 cent per kilowatt hour. They were paying 12 cents delivered, and they found a 1 cent pool of opportunities. So this is the type of thing that should be happening and scaling, and yet, as Amber points out, you still can't find any changes in mechanical engineering books in colleges talking about this type of stuff. So I mentioned the cradle-to-cradle continuous commissioning, and that's what BIM 7 allows. And even though it's proven and being used in buildings today, probably just 1 or 2% of architect engineering firms, I think, probably use this. And these are the types of additional value you can bring to it, whether it's solar radiation analysis, ventilation and airflow analysis, shading analysis, daylighting analysis. One of the most intriguing companies, Infosys, one of the world's largest IT companies out of India, hired Amory's top engineer to come to India, and Peter Rumsey, who is one of the most brilliant mechanical engineers in the country when it comes to high-efficiency buildings. And the CEO said, my builders tell me this is the best they can do. So we're going to build 2 buildings exactly the same, side by side. You take one, and they're going to take the other, and let's see you prove what you can do. And this was a very hot environment. So Peter went in, and he came in below budget with 50% less energy consumption, and that absolutely transformed Infosys because they took what Peter achieved, and then they layered it with all their IT wireless smart sensors, and they got another 30% savings. So brand new building, 80% savings in an extraordinarily hot environment. Well, they operate in 80 cities around the world. So they've taken their green infrastructure internal team, and they've now created a new service, and they're marketing this worldwide. And I think it goes very well with their other line of business, fintech, where they're one of the leaders in blockchain technology. So they can integrate blockchain, and for those of you who haven't followed blockchain, this is the hottest new thing. It's a microledger that's encrypted, and if they say that it can't be cracked, well, we'll see. I mean, there's been a few early crackings, but then they say, well, they were a little loose with their program or something. But in any event, blockchain it's used by the military for encrypting our weapon systems. It's used now by insurance companies and banks. Unilever is using it to look at their supply chain. So when they say we're sourcing child labor-free, not illegal resources, they can go right back to the field or the source and encrypt the information and be assured that they're getting what they are sold. So I'm not going to go through the details, but these are the specifics of what they were able to achieve. And I think they really are an iconic company of what is achievable. And IBM and Cisco and a bunch of others are following suit to try and get aboard this. Because the lifecycle continuous commissioning also offers all these amazing value addeds that are just not part of the normal system today. So, of course, the simulations and apps are permeating the solar and wind, as they have been for decades in the oil, gas, and nuclear industry. But now GE is doing predictive maintenance offshore wind platforms through remote sensing, and of course, cutting down the cost, like Scotland, which is moving very rapidly, becoming 100% wind dominant country, is doing floatable platforms now in collaboration with a former oil company, Statoil, which I first learned about, again, through Bob, who was working on carbon sequestration. They were being campaigned against when I was working for a large conservation organization for going into rainforest areas. So we met with them, and I said to the CEO, well, why don't you take your offshore oil platform technology and do offshore wind platforms? And he kind of, flimsy idea. Well, they now are the major player in offshore wind platforms, and they're working with a consortium that also includes our ArcelorMittal, the steel company, which it's a cluster of sustainability case studies that is quite extraordinary. And the most recent prices are getting down to 5 cents levelized cost of electricity offshore, 5 cents per kilowatt hour in Europe. And Fraunhofer Institute, a very well-respected European science research center, estimates that we'll see offshore at about 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So you look at, again, this $13 trillion market opportunity where the main, most of the world population lives. These are some of the, we're trying to get a demonstration of our VR built. So these are a few slides that we assembled. As you can see, you can't do a whole lot on PowerPoint, but the idea is you put your goggles on, and you step into the climate room. You see the temperature of the Earth is going up. You can take your finger and you pull the temperature down. Up comes a strategic screen and shows you like the 8 major things that have to be done. And you select what you're interested in. Say, could be biochar, could be solar or wind, but let's say you pick solar. Then up comes various options, tactical options, who's doing what, whether it's in government legislation or utility regulation, or it could be investing, or it could be community siting, but you select what you're interested in, and then it allows you to track and follow what you're getting engaged in and what others are engaged in. You can do through the headsets. We're particularly thinking of campuses now where students, there's AR, VR labs going in campuses all over the country. And the idea is that you get these students working together. And they can take a city like Arizona State wants to take Phoenix and then take the state and map it all out. So at least you have the inventory. You have an asset inventory of what are you missing on a daily basis and when are you going to take advantage of it. So it begins to become a new tool for persuasion among the policy and regulatory makers. The problem was we went to, one of our advisors works for, as the Chief Sustainability Officer at Facebook, and they own Oculus VR. So he got us into the coding conference, which is a very she event. And I tend not to go to the hackathons because there only tends to be 2 or 3 people over 40. And so April goes, she gets along great with them. And one of the coders loved our concept, said, well, I'll write you a demo for free. And so he she flew up to Oregon and spent a whole month working with them. And they were right in the middle of it, and it turned out that he's bipolar and he was collapsed into his depression and could not do any more work. So there we had an unfinished coded project. So right now she's looking, she just got back from Florida where she went down to another climate VR conference to see if she can find some new coders. But it's very frustrating. And I definitely am not at an age where I want to learn Unity, which is the coding language. Just to maybe wrap up, we already know the most important short-term things. I mean, there's been so much written about it. This is why, for me, visualizing it is really important. And we have an endless amount of recommendations for every sector involved in solving these wicked problems. We even have a lot of economic analysis on what can be done with, this is just looking at municipalities, utilities, where the cost of on-site solar and ground spot or solar garden canopies. Now, we're probably halfway through the slides. But I like to put slides together because I've given, I don't know, 1,500 or more talks. And afterwards, I used to get a stack of cards. Would you please mail me your printouts? And I love to get everybody's slides, so I felt obligated. But it was impossible. That's why I went to digital. And so then I found people ask questions, and so I tried to preempt them in the talk. And then I decided, well, let's just start documenting it. So don't take my word for it. Here's transparency. There's about, I don't know, several hundred top citations in this talk. And I figure also, you know, this is a VIP group right here, but there's plenty of people out there that will see the podcast and access the slides. So the types of things that I go through is a lot of the stuff I find to be extremely important of why the eruptions need to be addressed, like this one example here. Humanity releases every 10 hours the same amount of CO2 emissions that were released from one of the worst volcanic eruptions in recent history, Mount Pinatubo in 1992. Or the fact that it's not just, you know, CO2. In China, they're facing what I, as a child growing up in smoggy LA, these are LA lungs from smog. That's a non-smoker. So there's a lot of opportunities for solving multiple problems simultaneously. We're right now, the most recent research, Ken Caldera, one of the top climate scientists in the world, and his colleagues came out with a recent paper that said there's a 93% chance we're going to hit 4 degrees C the way we're currently going. I mean, that's, it's hard to believe. Now, what's the most severe thing about this? Well, the tipping elements, these catastrophic reactions when you get to a certain temperature point. And so coral reefs are the one you hear about most, where we're already seeing 30% of coral reefs dead, and bleaching events are expected to pretty much, because they're recurring more frequently, to pretty much by 2050 and 2 degrees C rise, we'll see virtually all coral reefs gone. But you're also going to see some other things happening. These are a dozen tipping elements that scientists say. One is the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, which we're already seeing massive melting, but also the shifting of Amazon forest or the Congo Basin forest to shrubland. Massive pulses, 100 gigaton pulses, 2 years worth of emissions will die back. But I don't want to dwell on this. One of the top economists in the world, Martin Weitzman, has taken all of his fellow economists to task for thinking that we should solve this problem with a cost-benefit analysis, which is really done for just short-term problems of priority ranking, how we're going to spend money. It's really an insurance problem. How much insurance do we want to buy to protect against these god-awful catastrophes? And tongue-in-cheek, he did this paper initially during the invasion of Iraq. And he said, well, rough comparisons of how much insurance, catastrophe insurance for climate, could perhaps be made with the potentially huge payoffs, small probabilities, and significant costs involved in countering terrorism, building anti-ballistic missile shields, or neutralizing hostile dictatorships possibly harboring weapons of mass destruction. A crude natural metric for calibrating cost estimates for the US would be what we're already spending on clean environment, which is about 3%. So 3%, I calculated, would rate for the $74 trillion global would be about $2.5 trillion a year that should be going towards solving this problem. And that could be, well, this is something quite different. We're spending instead $400 billion a year. Most of the models for climate project that we're going to do very little between now and 2050, and as a result, half of all of the solutions are going to have to come through what are called negative emission technologies, whether some form of geoengineering or carbon capture and sequestration. The one that, of course, none of these are proved as a biomass energy. Carbon capture and storage is one that's considered to be the more viable, but if you put it into ecological context, there's a lot of serious problems. First of all, the land area. To just do the amount that, I think 1 gigaton would require about the size of India, I think was one calculation. It would require 20 million tons of nitrogen, which is a fifth of total global fertilizer production. It would consume 4 trillion cubic meters of water, which is the total annual global water extraction for all uses right now. So you're going to have to see 10x improvements in these technologies. But most of all, you want action now so that you can radically reduce the amount of what negative emission technologies are going to be needed in the future. And you can save money now. So, and then I had a lot more on the positive disruptions, but you can look at that online.